not sure that I'll get this covered in the allotted time today, but I'm going to go, I'll get finished. I want to read two verses of Scripture from John chapter 15, verses 12, and then focusing primarily on the thoughts in verse 13. Jesus speaking. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. It's not just to be a love in word and thought, but it's to be a love that is expressed and manifested as well as declared. Jesus says, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. That is why we're here today, to remember those who have made this ultimate expression of love, who so love their country, who so love their families, their nation, their way of life, that they were willing to go to combat, and they were willing to lay down their very lives. Now, I'm Christian, I'm a preacher of the Word of God, I've been for many years, but I'm also patriotic and I'm not a pacifist. I do not like violence and I do not like to fight. One of the reasons is I'm no good at it. I've done enough of it to know I'm no fighter. But if called upon, I have, and I would even at this point in my life. I do appreciate those who have gone to war. I was thinking about the good old boys that have served, and we were talking earlier about Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart was a Hollywood actor. Many of those men that became great stars in Hollywood were patriots. John Wayne was not. He played in all kinds of movies, but John Wayne did not go to service. A lot of them didn't, but Jimmy Stewart did. He was a pilot. He flew B-17s and B-29s. He did his entire tour of duty in Europe. He stayed in the military even after he came back and went into Hollywood and became big. He retired out of the Air National Guard as a brigadier general. Now I want to tell you something. Now, Jimmy Stewart's a man. When I heard about men like him, Charles Bronson, even Clark Gable, Clark served. Tyrone Powers, many of you may not realize it, he was one of the first Zorros, but he was a fighter pilot with the Marine Corps. And many of those men served, and I love their memory and the stands they took. One of the ones that I remember, and I called him in my video an all-American boy. You may not agree with me on this, but one of my favorite entertainers over the years was Elvis Presley. And I grew up, I was 10 years behind him in age, but I remember in the 50s, when he was first coming out, and as a little boy, I was hearing him. And when I saw him with those sideburns and motorcycles and leather jackets, I became a fan of Mr. Presley. But the one thing that I liked about him above all else was in the middle of his, or in the beginning of his career, when it was just taking off, Uncle Sam was there. I want you, boy. And Elvis had to call. He was becoming rich, he was becoming famous, his career just beginning to go, and the Army says, we want 2 years out of your life. Throw it all away, come with us. You know what Elvis did? He didn't run off to Canada, he didn't run off to Mexico, he didn't declare himself a Muslim, and therefore religiously, conscientiously objected to it like Cassius Clay and some others. I don't care how good a fighter Cassius Clay was, when he dodged a draft by becoming a Muslim, Muhammad Ali, I lost all respect for him. But Elvis Presley went to the military. He served courageously for 2 years. And at the end of that 2 years, he came out. He was a sergeant. And he had a fantastic record with the military. And then renewed his music and theatrical ministry, and he went on to finish his life doing that. But if one thing stands out above all else to me, it is the fact that when his country called and he was needed, he gave up everything to follow the call of his country. When a man does that, when a woman does that, when someone does that to me, they've got my respect, they've got my appreciation, and they've got my gratitude, and they move to a new level in society, because I came up in a generation when Uncle Sam called, they were running off to Canada. They were running off to Mexico. They were doing anything and everything they could to evade the draft. And it wasn't because they were conscientious objectors. It was because they were cowards and just did not believe in what we have and fighting for what we have. So I have a great appreciation for those, and I have a great appreciation for those who gave their lives. Now, Memorial Day was originally called Decoration Day. And it was a day set aside to remember those who had died in the service of their country. And they would go out and they would decorate the graves of those who had fallen. Now, there are a lot of stories as to its origin. And there are small towns all over the country who believe that they were the first to do that. But the first I heard was that a little group of ladies in the Southland wanted to honor the fallen of the Confederacy. And so they chose a day, they appointed a day in which they would take flowers and they would decorate and beautify the graves of those who had fallen in a way of saying thank you for that which you have done. In May of 1966, President Lyndon Johnson declared that Waterloo, New York was the first official town where this custom was celebrated, but they claim it is very hard to prove that so. But again, it was celebrated, and eventually in time, a general by the name of John A. Logan chose May the 5th, 1866 as a day when they made a declaration that May the 30th would be the day of decoration with flowers, the graves of all that had fallen, of their comrades both north and south that had died during the Civil War. This day was first observed on May the 30th, 1868. The first state to recognize it was New York in 1873. In 1890, it was accepted by the other northern states. At that time, we understand why, the South refused to accept it, and they honored their dead on separate days until after World War. I'm sure it was World War I or II, but I didn't write down the number, and I'm not sure, but it was after one of the World Wars. But in time, the custom was changed, not only to remember the dead and fallen of the Civil War, but to include all the wars that had been fought by Americans. It was celebrated by every state as on the last Monday of May. It should be noted, however, that many southern states observed a different day to honor the Confederate dead. Texas, January 19th. Alabama and Florida, Georgia, Mississippi observed May the 10th, and Louisiana, they observe it on Jeff Davison's birthday, which is June the 3rd. You don't see this much anymore, but there was a day when you used to see the VFW and different ones out selling poppies on Memorial Day. Anybody remember that? That little red flower they were selling? Well, this was started in 1915 by Marina Michael, and she came up with the idea to wear poppies on Memorial Day to honor the fallen. She was the first to wear one. She later went on to sell them to her friends and co-workers and donate the money to needy servicemen. Shortly before Memorial Day, 1922, the VFW was the first veterans group to adapt their custom and sell poppies. And so, just a little bit of a history of Memorial Day, and again, sort of to set the pace and help us to remember. Now, I've got some statistics here that I want to read for you, and understand something. I wasn't there. I didn't take the tally. I'm just sharing with you information that I have heard. But from my sources, here are the numbers concerning some of the wars. Now, the wars that America has fought, I don't know if you've ever tried to find out how many wars we fought. You know about the major wars. That's all I'm going to talk about. But there are a lot of wars. We have been a people that we had to fight to get what we had, and we have had to fight to maintain it down through the years of time. And we're going to have to fight to maintain what we have today, because they're endeavoring to take away from us. They're taking away our history. They're taking away our heroes and trying to turn them into villains. And they're trying to say it ain't so. And they're wanting to write their history in their own fashion and idea, and they're changing it drastically. If we don't stand up and do something, you're not even going to begin to remember any of this. But during the Civil War, they claimed that 800,000 to 1,000,000 men died and lost their lives. Believe it or not, most of them were from the North. You know, the Rebs must have been pretty good shots. Those squirrel guns and the things they did, because probably about 3 times as many Northerners died as did Southerners. About 1,000,000 men during that period of time. In World War I, there was 116,516 men died. World War II, there was 407,000 died. In the Korean War, 54,000 men. Vietnam, 58,000 men. Iraq, 4,507. Afghanistan, 2,300. So, you can see that these figures are staggering. And to think that all of these men died trying to preserve and answering the call of our nation at that time. And so a day was set aside to remember them. Now, we remember our family, our friends, our loved ones, and our neighbors every day. Not a day goes by. Many of you go out to the cemetery, and periodically during the week you will put flowers or visit just to be with them. Well, friend, this is the one day that we're to remember the military and the fallen of the military, and to do what we can to honor their memory. And again, it applies to all the wars that have been fought in our nation. And what we're saying to them today is that we remember. We remember, first of all, that they were young men and women of every walk of life. You know, they didn't empty out the crack houses and the drug parlors and the opium bins and the prison to take those men for warriors and soldiers and combatants to represent our interests on the battlefield. If you think about that, they took the very best that we had. Our young men and women in their prime and at the peak of life, they were young men and women of every color, ethnic background, and standing in life. And you know, when you uniform up and you go shoulder to shoulder to combat, you're not worried about what color the guy is next to you or what his background may be. You are brothers in arms. And brother, you're going to fight with them and for them and love them. And today we recognize that it wasn't just white men. Now, I am absolutely not a racist. I know that there are many white people that fought and died, but there were many black people. I especially like the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. And being a pilot, I like anything that flies. I like a bug that flies across the room. But these guys were unheralded. But it was a black fighter unit that fought during World War II, flying those P-51s and those Mustangs and escorting our B-17s and our bombers. And understand something. You know who the best fighters are? Do they tell us, without question, the best fighters in the Army, the ground grunts, are the Puerto Ricans. And you know, they're not white or black. They're kind of in between. And but you know, we don't pay attention to that sort of thing. Many of them had distinguished themselves. And so we recognize today that we're not just honoring the fallen white men, we're following the black and the red. There were Indians that represented us well. There were Puerto Ricans, there were Hispanic, and they came from every walk in life. Some of them just coming to America and becoming citizens and signing up to go to war to represent us. And so we remember them and we think very fondly of who they were. They were young men from the country, farm boys. They were young men from the cities and young men from high school and from college. They were people who had homes, who had visions, who had dreams, who had ambitions, who had plans, who had families and sweethearts and children. In other words, they were men and women just like you and I. They really, probably the majority of them, did not want to go to war. Now there's always that element that does. There's always that element that just likes to fight. And I grew up with some of those guys, and thank God when you get on the battlefield in a bad situation, it's good to have that guy alongside him because he's not afraid and he's having a good time. But for the most part, they did not want fighting and did not want to go to war. But the nation called and they went. I'm thinking right now of a B-17 pilot. His name was J.B. Buffington. And I got to know Dr. Buffington many years ago because he was pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in Lakeland, Florida. And oh my, 40-some years ago, Don would go down there vacationing in the wintertime, and we would go to his church on Sunday. We were there, and I got to know him, and over the years, him and I became friends, but no more did I love him than when I found out the day that he had been a B-17 pilot. And he served, he flew all of his combat tours in Europe. He came through unscathed. And he said, you know, those flak jackets, he said, I'll tell you what we did with them. He said, we sat on them. I won't say any more about that, but flak came up from below, so they protected themselves. But he told me this after he came out of the military. He said, what I did. He said, I then enrolled in Tennessee Temple. I went to Bible college, came into the ministry. He said, I never flew again. Well, most men that are flyers fly because they love to fly. But he didn't love to fly. I said, well, why did you do it? He said, it was a job. It was a way for me to serve my country. And so Dr. Buffington left his career even to go into the ministry, and he became a combat pilot of that big B-17 bomber, served his time, came out, laid it aside, and then went on to serve in the ministry for many, many years after that, winning souls and preaching the gospel. I'm saying this, they came from every walk of life, and dear friend, many of them sacrificed much. They did not desire to end their lives on the battlefield. I put several pictures on the internet this week, and I have two Facebook pages, one under Archie, one under Robert. And on both of them, I put pictures. Now, being an airplane buff and loving that thing, I've gone to air shows, and at least I used to. And when we went there, Don and I always looked out the Warbirds. That's the old World War II planes and World War I. And we had pictures taken in front of the P-51, the Corsair, the B-17, and others, B-25. But I put several of those pictures on Facebook. And one of them is of one of these flying fortresses, B-17. I'm standing right there in front of it. There's a big plane behind me, and I put the little caption on there, and I said this: every time that plane went down, 10 men lost their lives. Now, if they didn't jump out and parachute in, sometimes they did, but if they did not, they would have died, and they would have given their life. 10 men. Sometimes 1,000 of those planes would go out, and hundreds of them would be lost over Europe. And every time, just with the B-25 carried 10 men. The B-24 may have, I'm not sure, they had a lot. But every time it went down, that number of men. And so, friend, you can understand this, that those men did not want to end their lives like that. The plane on fire and burning and falling from the sky. You know, years ago, a very prominent preacher by the name of Lester Roloff from Texas died in a plane crash. Lester was a pilot, and Lester was the kind of pilot who should never have flown. He should have stuck to the buses and airlines and that sort of thing because he wasn't meticulous. And he was a little haphazard. He absolutely went so far in his training. He got instrument rated, and that means he could fly in the clouds and didn't have to see the ground. And he got a real sophisticated plane that was a six-place plane and high performance and everything. And he was the kind of guy that was just kind of slack. And they claimed that he would be up there flying and put on an autopilot, sit in the cockpit and go to sleep. He'd wake up when the engine quit and the plane started falling, and he'd come out of it. But one day he was up there with 5 girls. He was on a preaching engagement. They were singers, and they were from his home. where he rescued these children, and 5 girls were with him, and he got too near a thunderstorm, and the horses just tore the wings right off that plane, and they fell from like 19,000 foot. They claim it took a minute and a half or so to fall. A minute and a half, you're inside that thing that's swirling, and you know you're going to die. Well, that's how those guys died over there in Europe. Often, they knew what was coming. They knew it was the end. They knew they would never see their families again. And those planes burning and descending. And friend, not only was it in the air, but it was also on the sea. You know, many of the sailors can tell stories. I'll not mention names, but there was a man here on the shore who was a sailor, and he told me, he said, well, actually he was with the Coast Guard, assigned to the Navy, and he was running a landing craft on D-Day. And he said, I took a whole craft load of those boys, they were getting out, and I went to return back to my ship, and a plane hit on the ship, and my ship sunk, and I had to run that thing ashore and go with the Army. Another one told me, he said, I was with the Navy, and our ship got torpedoed, and it was going down, and he said, we were trapped below decks, and he said, the only way we could escape was through a tube that went up to the top. But he said they had a hatch, and said if that hatch had been locked, we wouldn't have gotten out. But we went up that tube, and he said we got to the end, and hopefully that hatch was open, and he got out. Well, those guys had stories. I'm telling you, they could tell you some stories of what went on. And so, dear friend, we remember that many of them did not get out. Many of them drowned. Many of them went down. We know that they faced a fierce and a strong enemy. You know, I don't know if you've ever done that sort of thing or not. Many of you guys, and maybe some of you ladies, have had contentions and conflict and may have been involved in a little skirmish, but for the most part, you're like we were in the State Police Academy. We had a whole week. We had defensive tactics, and we had boxing and fighting and wrestling and judo and everything under the sun. I got my nose broke for the second time during that period of time and got knocked down and beat up, but the sergeants reminded us as we were being thrashed terribly. He said, at least in here, if you declare uncle, we'll stop. Out there, they won't. And it's like it is with the military. They weren't going to play fisticuffs. They weren't going there to just have a tussle and see who was the toughest. They were going there, and it was a life and death situation. They were facing mortars and heavy artillery and machine guns and everything you can imagine. And so, friend, it would have been horrible. They had to deal with the combat, the horrors of combat. My Uncle Kermit told me, he said, in the South Pacific, he said, I went out on patrol. He said, sometimes I'd be one of 2 men return. He said, I was walking one day and my buddy was alongside me, and a shell hit him and blew a hole that big right through his midsection. The things they saw, the boys, I had cousins who made it through Vietnam, and when they come home, the family said they wouldn't even sleep in the bed. They slept on the ground. And some of them turned to drugs and alcohol. And the mind was so seared by the things that were happening. We can't even begin to imagine the price that they paid, and the fear and the terror, the sights and the sounds. The price they paid. Remember that they left behind wives and children and family and parents and loved ones that they would never see again. They left behind their careers, their dreams, their aspirations, and their plans. But we remember their courage. We remember their anxiety, confusion, doubt, and worry, and the cold hand of death. Some of them dying alone in mud and blood, falling from the sky, drowning. A million more different ways. Some of them died unheralded, unknown, unappreciated, and forgotten. Never in this world to be forgotten or to be remembered. They made the greatest sacrifice, the contribution to our nation. And today we're saying, we remember you. Thank you. You are not forgotten. You're remembered. You're appreciated. God bless you. And even to this day, many are remembered. Now this we should know about them. Sometimes we think of those who perished in combat are gone. That was the end of life. Now understand this. Our sojourn on earth is just a small portion of our life experience. Physical death does not end life. It ends life as a physical being. But understand, man's a trinity. Body, soul, and spirit. The soul and spirit of man is eternal. And when one experiences physical death, they are released into the realm of God, in the realm of eternity. They are destined to live forever. Now, they tell me that there's no atheist in foxholes. And I'm confident that many of these men and women who died in combat were men and women of faith, and who in their last moments were looking to God and praying. The Lord said, no greater love has this than a man lay down his life for his friend. They're making the ultimate sacrifice, and having made that, they're crying out to God. They were whisked by the angels of God into the very presence of heaven, where they're waiting today. No more pain, no more suffering, no more sorrow, no more death. And there they are waiting that glorious day of resurrection, that glorious day where their contribution will be rewarded. You know, we reward the living. We were talking earlier about Aldy Murphy, about Sergeant York, and these men who some of them have distinguished themselves on the battlefield and been highly decorated by our nation, some after death. But understand this, the day's coming when they're going to stand before God. Now, they're not going to be saved because they were patriotic. They're going to be saved because they trusted Jesus. But many of them did trust Jesus. And many of them are going to stand before God, and they're going to be recognized, commended, and rewarded for the sacrifice that they made. But more importantly, they're going to see their family and their loved ones again. Well, my time is gone, but I'm just getting into my message. I won't have time to finish it, but let me say this to you. What we have today, we owe to that group of people and the survivors. And friend, we have a responsibility to them, to remember them, to honor them, to pass this on to the generations to come. But friend, we have a responsibility as well to do our best to maintain what they've given us. You see, something like America has got to be maintained. You just can't, you know, if you get a home, you people know this, and you move into a new home and you begin to use that home, as time goes by, it's going to begin to deteriorate, have issues and problems, and the wise person is the person who keeps up on it. It's the same thing with your cars. It's the same thing with a family. You got to work at it, keep it going. Same thing with the country. We've been given a treasure. I believe America is the greatest nation on the face of the earth. But there are forces tearing at it to tear it apart from within and from without. We need to be aware of that, and we need to do our part to maintain it. Now,